Project Blue Book, which lasted all the way through 1969, was not to investigate anything. It was rather to explain it. To say, look, you guys think you don't understand this, but we do. We're the all-powerful government. We're the all-powerful CIA. We can explain this.
I cannot prove in a court of law that marsh gas is the full explanation of these sightings. But it does appear to me extremely likely.
You're saying, Doctor, that Michigan is now producing non-existent saucers?
Well, it's one way of putting it, I suppose.
The pilots often described these objects were sort of fuzzy lights. It could be a plasma light that would come up from the ground towards the airplane. And we know that now because there have been reinvestigations of all the files.
Washington International was picking up UFO returns. People were reporting sightings of strange lights in the sky. The press, having gone through this thing the week before, were better prepared, and they were down at the Washington International Airport asking what these things were that were being picked up by radar.
Alright, I'm going to kick things off with a little mission from World War II called Operation Mincemeat. So this whole operation does not sound like something that would happen in real life. If someone were to sit down and outline this plan to your face, you'd probably laugh and then be like, we are in the middle of World War II though, so like, why are you joking around? We have kind of an important job to do here. But all of this really did happen. So this mission was carried out by the British, and the goal here was to throw off Germany about the Allies' plans for an upcoming military operation. So in 1943, the British got hold of the body of a guy who died after eating rat poison. Then they dressed him up as an officer and created a complete fictional identity for him. They attached a briefcase containing fake documents to his wrist, and then released the body off the coast of Spain. The documents contained all these clues that kind of pointed to the Allies planning to launch an invasion in southern Europe. The idea was to make the Axis powers think the Allies were planning to attack where they least expected, causing them to divert their military away from the actual target. Everything just hinged on this body being found and the Germans figuring out the clues in these fake documents. And by some miracle, it all works. The body washed up on shore, it was discovered, the Germans were contacted, and they fell for the ruse. And this ended up being a big part of the success of the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943, known as Operation Husky. By tricking the enemy into expecting an attack in a different location, Operation Mincemeat helped create the advantage the Allies needed.
Next up we have the Ghost Army, another secretive World War II operation. This was top secret Allied unit, a real creative bunch called the Ghost Army. Their mission was to fool the enemy. This special unit was made up of artists, designers, and actors with a mission to create big illusions to trick the Axis forces. Again, this is gonna sound like a Monty Python sketch, but the Ghost Army actually used things like inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery, basically giant balloons that looked like real military equipment. From a distance, these inflatable props, also known as rubber dummies, were so convincing that even enemy planes were fooled. The idea was to make the enemy think there was a huge army when, in reality, there were just a handful of soldiers. The Ghost Army also played with sound and radio to play tricks. They broadcasted fake radio signals that mimicked the sounds of a large army, complete with fake talk and secret code words. This made the enemy believe that the Allied forces were moving in different directions than they actually were. The Ghost Army's existence was top secret for a long time. It was only in the 90s that their existence became declassified.
Next up, we have more inflatable fun with the blow-up dolls the CIA would use to dupe the KGB during the Cold War. And yes, they used that type of blow-up doll, the ones that lonely people use. Not me. A man named Walter McIntosh was behind this creative little trick. He's been behind some of the most successful CIA missions in history, but this one was probably his strangest. So there was a big problem for the CIA. All their spies in Moscow were always being followed around by pesky Russian counter spies. The US was watching Russia, Russia was watching the US. It's just how it was. at the time. It was a spy festival everywhere you went. And being that this was the 70s, adult shops are kind of like McDonald's. They were just all over the place. At least that's how I kind of always picture the 70s. So they got the bright idea to use some of these nighttime dolls as decoys to allow CIA operatives to quickly slip out of the passenger side of their vehicles while the driver quickly inflated the doll, making it appear as though there was still two people in the car. As long, as they weren't being pursued too closely, this did prove to be pretty effective.
Next up we have Operation Jedburgh. In the thick of World War II, there was a covert plan called Operation Jedburgh that brought together teams of unique trios of soldiers. Each team had 3 soldiers, each from a different allied nation, who would be dropped behind enemy lines to cause some trouble for the Axis powers. These teams were secret squads, often included one soldier from the US, another from the UK, and the third from somewhere else in the allied crew. They parachuted into occupied territory in Europe to team up with the local resistance groups. They were trained to be sneaky, pulling off guerrilla warfare tactics. Their job was to stir things up, sabotage enemy operations, gather intel, and generally make life difficult for the Third Reich. They'd blow up bridges, disrupt supply lines, and gather info about enemy movements.
Next on the list we have Operation Chaos. Now this one is one of the most controversial top secret operations in US history. Definitely not as positive as many of the stuff on this list, but you can bet it had a pretty big impact on the people's trust in the government going forward. Operation Chaos was an operation from 1967 to 1974. It was a top secret CIA project targeting US citizens. The goal was to keep tabs on, and in some cases just infiltrate groups that were critical of the government, especially those involved or suspected of being involved in anti-Vietnam War and civil rights activity. It'd secretly gather all this info on these groups and figure out what they were planning. At every protest, meeting, rally at the time, whatever, you could bet there were agents keeping an eye on things and gathering information. They'd even use fancy gadgets to electronically eavesdrop on people. It was government overreach at its finest, a total violation of people's privacy.
Next up we have Operation Fortitude South. This was a very slick move during World War II that involved some serious bluffing. So during the lead up to D-Day, the big Allied invasion in Normandy, everybody knows something massive is brewing, but where and when. The Allies wanted to keep the Germans guessing about where the main attack was coming from. So kinda like with Operation Mincemeat, they came up with this plan to make it look like the invasion was going down in a different spot. They set up a fake army they referred to as the First US Army Group, complete with inflatable tanks and trucks. They were designed to trick German reconnaissance planes into thinking a big invasion force was gearing up in the Pas de Calais, when the actual invasion was going down in Normandy. They wanted the Germans to concentrate their defenses there, leaving Normandy a bit more vulnerable. Well, in the end, the bluff worked and the Allies pulled off one of the most significant military maneuvers of the war.
Next on the list we have Project Blue Book. Now, it's hard to say how much of an impact this really had on history. That really depends where you stand on the existence of aliens, and if you know anything about me, you know I'm big into them. So Project Blue Book is good in my book. Most of this stuff is also kept very top secret, so we don't really know 100% what they found, but it's pretty cool that this group even existed in the first place. Project Blue Book was a branch of the United States Air Force that ran from 1952 to 1969, and their sole focus was investigating reports of unidentified flying objects, pretty much the real-life X-Files. There was a big surge in UFO sightings in the early 50s to the point where it kind of became a public concern. I'm sure that didn't have anything to do with all the sci-fi movies coming out at the time. But the Air Force established Project Blue Book to go out and collect, analyze, and then document all these UFO reports. Thousands of sightings were reported and investigated during its existence. So when someone reported a UFO sighting, it would be examined by experts from Project Blue Book to try and see if there were any natural, everyday explanations for what people were seeing. And if an incident couldn't be easily explained, it was officially labeled as unidentified. One of the most famous cases investigated by Project Blue Book was the 1965 UFO sighting in Exeter, New Hampshire. Witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the sky, and 2 police officers even saw a large unidentified craft hovering above some trees, with one of the officers being quoted saying it was as big as a barn. The Air Force couldn't come up with any logical explanation.
Next up is Operation Gunnicide. So this was a crucial mission during World War II where a group of Norwegian exiles and British sabotaged a heavy water production facility in German-occupied Norway. Heavy water was crucial in Germany's atomic bomb project, so if successful, this would throw a wrench into the Third Reich's development of nuclear weapons. In 1943, a team of Norwegians were parachuted into the rugged terrain near the facility. The team successfully infiltrated the facility after dodging guards and mines. They snuck into the plant through a cable duct, planted explosives, and then got out of there before setting them off, causing significant damage to the facility. This set the Germans back 6 months. Then a year later, Norwegians sabotaged the Third Reich again when they sunk a ship hauling a big supply of heavy water to Germany.
Alright, next up we have Operation Gold, also known as Operation Stopwatch. This was another Cold War era intelligence mission carried out by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. The mission had a very specific target, the Soviet Union's communication lines. There was a lot of tension between the Western powers and the Soviet Union, especially in the early years of the Cold War. Everyone was trying to figure out what the other side was up to. Now, communication is key, and the Soviets were sending messages via telegraph cables that ran through the city of Berlin. Operation Gold was hatched to secretly tap into these cables to eavesdrop and gather intel. So they went about this in probably the bluntest way possible. They tunneled under the city so they could have direct access to the communication lines and tap into them. A tunnel was dug from West Berlin to East Berlin, and it was fully equipped with listening devices. But things didn't quite go according to plan, to put it lightly. The Soviets found out about the tunnel. Actually, they'd really known about it pretty much all along. There was a mole in the operation. Literally, see what I did? It's a mole. It's underground. There's a man named George Blake. He'd informed the KGB of the CIA and M16's plan. The KGB didn't immediately expose it either. Instead, they let the operation continue while having some fun and feeding them false info through the tapped lines. Eventually though, in 1956, the Soviets revealed that they did know about the tunnel, pretending they'd accidentally stumbled on it.
And finally, we have the arrest of Robert Hanssen. Not the butcher baker Robert Hanssen, Robert Hanssen the spy. I don't know how you'd confuse the two. Hanssen was a former FBI agent who became one of the most infamous double agents in the history of espionage. He spied for the Soviet Union and later Russia from 1979 to 2001, giving them sensitive material for over 2 decades. Top secret stuff related to US counterintelligence and national security. This whole story really does sound like it's from a spy movie. It's hard to believe stuff like this actually happens, but it actually happened. He would use dead drops, secret locations where he would leave information for his Russian handlers to pick up. It went on for years, again from 1979 to 2001. Somehow he managed to avoid suspicion for all of that time. The FBI had been investigating leaks of classified information and began to suspect Hanssen was involved. It was in 2001 that he was finally exposed. When the FBI finally arrested Hanssen, they found that he had compromised a number of intelligence operations and even exposed the identities of US agents working against the Soviet Union and Russia. In 2002, he was convicted of espionage and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Number 10 spot, we have the 1976 Tehran incident. The 1976 Tehran UFO incident is a notable case in UFOlogy that took place on September 19, 1976. The incident involved a luminous object that was observed hovering over the city by 2 F-4 Phantom II jet interceptors of the Iranian Air Force. The object was detected on radar and appeared to be capable of jamming the communication systems of the jets. The pilots reported that they saw a brightly lit diamond-shaped object that emitted a green light, and they attempted to engage it with missiles. However, the object evaded their attempts and quickly disappeared. At a pilots conference in 2007, one of the pilots in this incident, Parvez Jafari, said he attempted to fire at the UFO, but something strange was preventing him from doing so. He said, quote, "My weapons jammed and my radio communications garbled." The incident was investigated by the Iranian government and the US Defense Intelligence Agency, and it has been the subject of much speculation and debate among UFO enthusiasts. Some argue that the incident was evidence of extraterrestrial activity, while others suggest it may have been a secret military experiment or some kind of atmospheric phenomenon. Despite the official investigation, the incident remains unresolved and its true nature remains a mystery. In our number 9 spot today, we have the McMinnville UFO photographs. The McMinnville UFO photographs are a series of 2 photographs taken by Paul and Evelyn Trent on May 11th, 1950 in McMinnville, Oregon. The photos depict a metallic disc-shaped object in the sky with trees and buildings visible in the foreground. The Trents claimed that they saw the object hovering in the sky and were able to capture it on camera. The photographs quickly gained widespread attention and were widely circulated in newspapers and magazines, and they were also examined by several experts, including the US Air Force, which conducted an investigation known as Project Blue Book. Famous project here on Most Amazing Top 10. The Trents maintained that the photographs were genuine and that they had not tampered with them in any way. However, some skeptics have suggested that the photographs may have been hoaxed or that the objects in the photographs were just a common object. Despite the controversy surrounding the photographs, however, they remain one of the most famous and well-known UFO sightings in history. The photographs have been the subject of numerous articles, books, and documentaries, and have inspired countless discussions and debates about the existence of UFOs and extraterrestrial life. In our number 8 spot today, we have the USS Nimitz Tic Tac UFO incident. This UFO sighting comes from 2004. On November 14th of that year, the USS Princeton noticed an unknown aircraft of some sort that was about 100 miles off of the coast of San Diego. For 2 weeks prior to this, the crew had been tracking a strange flying object that would start out at about 80,000 feet before extremely quickly dropping to hover right above the Pacific Ocean. Commander David Fravor and Lieutenant Commander Jim Slate went over in 2 fighter jets, and when they arrived, they saw what at first appeared to be churning water while there was an oval shape just below the surface. After this, the white oval-shaped object appeared above the water, but it had no markings on it. Like no windows, nothing that would indicate an engine, no wings, and the infrared monitors on the jets didn't pick up any sort of exhaust. The commander and lieutenant commander tried to intercept this strange aircraft, but it very quickly flew away and reappeared on the monitor 60 miles away. And when I say quickly, I mean it was moving at 3 times the speed of sound and over twice the speed of the fighter jets. So, faster than any kind of technology we currently have. We still don't know exactly what it was, but it certainly was beyond our current capabilities. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Aguadilla Airport incident. The Aguadilla Airport UFO incident occurred on April 25th, 2013, when a strange object was spotted hovering above the Rafael Hernandez Airport in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico. The object was initially detected by radar and later confirmed by security cameras as a glowing, unidentified object that appeared to be traveling at a low altitude. The object was described as being around 4 to 5 feet in length, and it moved very quickly and very erratically. It was also observed to emit a bright white light and appeared to be changing shape. The incident attracted widespread attention and was investigated by several government agencies, including the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Homeland Security. The object was ultimately classified as an unidentified flying object, or UFO, and no explanation was given for its presence in the area. It is even said that a US Customs and Border Protection aircraft actually captured infrared video of the incident that was given to the Scientific Coalition for UFOlogy by a whistleblower. This video is said to show the UFO traveling at super low altitudes, sometimes lower than the treetops, but at speeds close to 100 miles per hour. The Aguadilla Airport UFO incident is considered one of the most significant UFO sightings in recent history due to the high level of documentation and the involvement of government agencies. It continues to be a topic of discussion and speculation among UFO enthusiasts and researchers, and has contributed to ongoing efforts to uncover the truth about the nature and origin of UFO sightings around the world. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Project Blue Book sighting. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Richard French was once tasked with being an investigator for Project Blue Book, which was the name used to describe a study of UFOs conducted by the United States Air Force from March 1952 to December 17, 1969, when the project was terminated. Okay, we talk about Project Blue Book a lot. You gotta know what it is. While his job was meant to be to investigate and essentially debunk UFO sightings, later in life he took to Congress to stand up and explain his own UFO encounter that he was never able to explain away. The moment that truly stuck with him all of these years took place back in 1952 when he was sent off to Newfoundland after there were reports of a UFO that had crashed off of the coast of St. John's. As he arrived to the scene, there were at least 100 people who all stood and stared into the water, and as he was able to follow their gaze and see what they were all looking at, he couldn't quite believe his eyes. He recalled the water being quite clear, and under it you could see 2 circular circular crafts, each one approximately 18 feet in diameter. He said that they were both floating just below the surface of the water, no more than 20 feet from the shore, and not only this, but he could also see two beings with the crafts. He said, quote, "The first thing I saw was the UFOs, and it was apparent to me that they were doing something to the craft, and I couldn't really tell what because they were on the bottom side of it and not visible to me except when they would occasionally get over to the side where I could see them." He claims he watched on as the beings worked on the craft until one of them raised out of the water and disappeared, but not before accelerating to speeds in the neighborhood of 2,500 to 3,000 miles per hour. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Coyne-Mansfield helicopter incident. The Coyne-Mansfield helicopter UFO incident occurred on October 18, 1973, when 4 members of the Ohio Army National Guard were flying in a helicopter over Mansfield, Ohio. Suddenly, they encountered a large metallic disc-shaped object that was hovering in the sky. The object began to move towards the helicopter, causing the crew to take evasive maneuvers. Despite their efforts, the object continued to follow them, eventually passing overhead and disappearing into the distance. The crew reported the incident to their superiors, and an investigation was launched by the military and the Federal Aviation Administration. The incident received significant media attention, and it remains one of the most compelling UFO sightings on record. What makes this incident particularly intriguing is the credibility of the witnesses. The crew were all experienced pilots with military training, and their account of the incident was corroborated by radar data and other witnesses on the ground. Despite extensive investigations, no satisfactory explanation has ever been offered for what they saw that day. In our number 4 spot today, we have Apollo 11. So we can sit here on Earth all day and talk about the potential for alien life and UFOs, but who would know more than the people who have actually been to space, which are of course astronauts. Definitely on the list of coolest and scariest jobs in the world, there haven't been a ton of people who have had the unbelievable privilege of experiencing space firsthand, but there are even less of them who have claimed to see something that seems completely unexplainable. People who have claimed these sorts of things include Edgar Mitchell, Catherine Coleman, and Dr. Brian O'Leary. The very interesting part about many of these claims is that they also include some sort of government cover-up as well with their claims. There was also Buzz Aldrin, who spoke about his Apollo 11 experience, and he detailed the crew seeing something flying alongside them, and at first they believed it was the final stage of a detached rocket, but then Mission Control confirmed that it was actually 6,000 miles away from them, leaving them with no answers on what the flying object could be. I can't imagine going to space at all, let alone encountering a UFO flying right beside you. Also, I can't believe that I hadn't heard of that story before, because to me, that sounds like full-blown alien contact. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Go Faster video. In 2017, after the existence of the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program became more well known, a video was released of an encounter between an FA-18 Super Hornet and some sort of unidentified flying object. This video was the third in a series of 3 videos, and there weren't a ton of details released about exactly what happened during this encounter. Using the Raytheon Advanced Targeting Forward-Looking Infrared Pod, they were able to capture an extremely fast-moving white oval that was around 45 feet long. The oval had no wings and didn't appear to have any kind of exhaust either. They were tracking the UFO at an altitude of 25,000 feet just above the Atlantic Ocean, and then they were shocked as the craft rotated on its axis and flew away. There was no explanation released with the footage because it truly is unbelievable and currently unexplainable. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Delphos Ring incident. The Delphos Ring UFO incident occurred on November 2nd, 1971 in Delphos, Kansas, when a family witnessed a strange object hovering over their farm. The UFO emitted a bright light that illuminated the surrounding area and left a glowing ring in the ground after it disappeared. The family reported the incident to the local sheriff, who took a sample of the ring for analysis. Investigations were conducted by several experts, including the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, who collected soil samples and found that the ring was caused by the removal of topsoil, which had been exposed to a high amount of heat. Additionally, a high level of radiation was also detected at the site. The incident received widespread media coverage and sparked debates about the existence of extraterrestrial life and the possibility of alien visitation. Some skeptics argued that the incident could have been caused by natural phenomena or a hoax, but the witnesses maintained that they saw a genuine UFO. Despite the years of investigation, it's been no conclusive explanation for the incident has been found, leaving the mystery of the Delphos Ring UFO unsolved. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Shag Harbor incident. This incident took place on October 4th, 1967, when an unknown object crashed into the water near Shag Harbor, which is a tiny town in Nova Scotia. There were at least 11 people who witnessed this object as it crashed, and many people claimed to have heard a whistling sound followed by a loud bang when the crash took place. The witnesses that claimed to have seen the UFO were all doing a bunch of different things at the time. One couple was just sitting out on their porch, but the two witnesses that really get me are a flight pilot and a ship captain. On Air Canada Flight 305, First Officer Robert Ralph pointed out to Captain Pierre Charbonneau that there was something strange out the left side of the aircraft. They reported an object tracking along on a parallel course a few miles away and described it as a brilliantly lit rectangular object with a string of smaller lights trailing it. Shortly after they first noticed it, there was a large but silent explosion near the unknown object, and then 2 minutes later there was a second explosion, but this one faded to a blue cloud. As for the ship captain, Captain Leo Howard Mercy, he saw 4 blips on his Decca radar that were totally stationary. This led to him looking up to the sky, and this is when he saw 4 bright objects sitting in a rectangular formation about 28 kilometers from the vessel's window. He wasn't the only one who saw it on board either. The entire crew of nearly 20 fishermen stood on deck and watched. A man named Laurie Wickens was another one of the witnesses, and he and some friends ended up calling the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, because they saw a huge object floating in the Atlantic Ocean about 1,000 feet offshore. This is all super weird, and not only the RCMP but also the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force became involved in the investigation, but nothing was ever recovered or found. It was also revealed that all commercial, private, and military aircrafts along the eastern seaboard were accounted for, so what could have all those witnesses seen? Since they never officially identified what it was, in the official Government of Canada documents, it is listed as a UFO. We have the Shag Harbor incident. This UFO encounter is often referred to as Canada's Roswell, so I was shocked that I hadn't heard of it before. Basically, this incident took place on October 4th, 1967, when an unknown object crashed into the water near Shag Harbor, which is a tiny town in Nova Scotia. There were at least 11 people who witnessed this object as it crashed, and many people claimed to have heard a whistling sound followed by a loud bang when the crash took place. The witnesses that claimed to have seen the UFO were all doing a bunch of different things at the time. One couple was just sitting on their porch, but the two witnesses that really get me are a flight pilot and a ship captain. On Air Canada Flight 305, First Officer Robert Ralph pointed out to Captain Pierre Charbonneau that there was something strange out the left side of the aircraft. They reported an object tracking along on a parallel course a few miles away and described it as brilliantly lit, rectangular object with a string of smaller lights trailing the object. Shortly after they first noticed it, there was a large but silent explosion near the unknown object, and then 2 minutes later there was a second explosion, but this one faded to a blue cloud. As for the ship captain, Captain Leo Howard Mercy saw 4 blips on his Decca radar that were totally stationary. This led to him looking up to the sky, and this is when he saw 4 bright objects sitting in a rectangular formation about 28 kilometers from the vessel's window. He wasn't the only one who saw it on board. The entire crew of nearly 20 fishermen stood on deck and watched. A man named Laurie Wickens was another one of the witnesses, and he and some friends ended up calling the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, because they saw a huge object floating in the Atlantic Ocean about 1,000 feet offshore. This is all super weird, and not only the RCMP but also the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force became involved in investigations, but nothing was ever recovered or found. But it also revealed that all commercial, private, and military aircrafts along the eastern seaboard were accounted for, so what could have all these witnesses seen? Since they have never officially identified what it was in the official Government of Canada documents, it is listed as a UFO. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Laken Heath Bentwaters incident. If you flash back to the first installment of this series, in part 1 I spoke about the Rendlesham Forest incident, and this one is kind of similar to that one, which only adds to its bizarre nature. In August of 1956, radio operators at Royal Air Force Bentwaters began to notice something strange on the radar. radar. Basically, there was some sort of aircraft, and whatever it was traveling at speeds of over 1,000 miles per hour. Of course, since this was near an Air Force base, they immediately sent training aircrafts up to intercept and investigate, but at that point it found nothing. Shortly after this, a ton of Air Force personnel on the ground began to see a bunch of bright lights in the sky, darting around quickly, and they were also being picked up on the radar again, this time traveling at even higher speeds, closer to 2,000 miles per hour. This is when they sent up 2 Venom interceptors and directed them towards the radar target that was now over Lakenheath. The pilot of the first Venom did achieve contact, but the UFO was quick to outmaneuver him and ended up behind him. The UFO actually chased this pilot for about 10 minutes, despite the pilot doing really aggressive, evasive tactics. The pilot was described as, quote, getting worried, excited, and also pretty scared during this encounter. In the end, they were forced to return to base, and the target remained on their radar screens for a short while before it disappeared. The Condon Committee looked into this case and made quite an unusual conclusion. They normally conclude that UFO sightings are due to some natural phenomena or aircraft, but in this incident they wrote, quote, in conclusion, although conventional or natural explanations certainly cannot be ruled out, the probability of such seems low in this case, and the probability that at least one genuine UFO was involved appears to be fairly high. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Valensole incident. Okay, I get it. Everywhere's gotta have their Roswell incident, and this one is said to be France's. This sighting was made by a man named Maurice Masse, who was a French farmer, and it took place in July of 1965. One day before starting work while outside smoking, Maurice witnessed an object coming out of the sky and landing in his lavender field about 200 feet away from where he was. He was of course frustrated at someone landing in his field and figured that it was likely a helicopter that made some sort of unauthorized landing, but as he got closer, things took a turn. He realized this was no helicopter and instead was some sort of oval-shaped structure that was standing on 4 legs. In front of the strange craft were 2 figures just under 4 feet tall. He explained that they were making sort of grumbling sounds and included a brief description of these creatures before explaining that one of them took out a pencil-like device and pointed it at him, which left him completely stuck in his tracks, just frozen in time. As he was stuck there, the creatures got back in their craft and took off, and after about 20 minutes he finally regained his ability to move. Here's the thing. To me, this sounds like a fantastical story, but there was some kind of physical evidence left behind that I, and many others, can't quite figure out an explanation to. Basically, the craft did end up leaving a mark. There was a hole and a lot of moisture left over from where the craft was. Like I mentioned, this was in the middle of a lavender field. Soon after, this area became really hard, almost like concrete, and definitely not like the soil everywhere else in the field, and all of the plants around this area started to die. Analysis of the soil revealed that there was a higher amount of calcium in the soil at the landing site than there was anywhere else in the lavender field. This definitely shows that there was some kind of unusual event. Could Maurice be telling the truth? In our number 7 spot today, we have the Project Blue Book sighting. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Richard French was once tasked with being an investigator for Project Blue Book, which was the name used to describe a study of UFOs conducted by the United States Air Force from March of 1952 to December 17, 1969, when the project was terminated. While his job was meant to be to investigate and essentially debunk UFO sightings, later in life he took to Congress to stand up to explain his own UFO encounter that he was never able to explain away. The moment that truly stuck with him all of these years was back in 1952 when he set off to Newfoundland after there were reports of a UFO that had crashed off the coast of St. John's. As he arrived to the scene, there were at least 100 people who all stood and stared into the water, and as he was able to follow their gaze and see what they were looking at, he couldn't believe his eyes. He recalled the water being quite clear, and under it you could see 2 circular crafts, each one approximately 18 feet in diameter. He said that they were both floating just below the surface of the water, no more than 20 feet from shore, and not only this, but he could also see 2 beings with the crafts. He said, quote, the first thing I saw was the UFOs, and it was apparent to me that they were doing something to the craft, and I couldn't really tell what because they were on the bottom side of it and not visible to me, except when they would occasionally get over to the side where I could see them. He claims he watched on as the beings worked on the craft until one of them raised out of the water and disappeared, but not before accelerating to speeds in the neighborhood of 2,500 to 3,000 miles an hour. In our number 6 spot today, we have the classified report. We aren't even a full month into 2023, but already there are some crazy announcements, including one regarding a report that was delivered to Congress from the Director of National Intelligence. Basically, since August of last year, there has been a total of 510 unidentified aerial phenomena observed in protected airspace or near sensitive facilities. According to the report, 26 of them were described as drones, 163 were labeled as balloons or balloon-like entities, and 6 were described as clutter, whatever that means. This is all fine and well, but the concern sets in when we consider that this leaves 171 sightings unaccounted for, some of which, quote, appear to have demonstrated unusual flight characteristics or performance capabilities. It's also important to note that the majority of these sightings are coming directly from Navy and Air Force pilots. Here's the thing, what we as the public know is only a 12-page declassified summary of the actual, real, secret report that was delivered to Congress. Only time will tell if we ever find out what the rest of the report includes or what will happen with the further investigation into the 171 sightings, but hopefully if answers do arise, one day we'll find out. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Westall incident. Taking it back to 1966, we have the largest mass UFO sighting in Australia that, at the time, was largely ignored. This incident took place when over 300 students and staff members of a school in Melbourne all witnessed multiple UFOs silently flying through the air before they landed in a nearby field. While there's been a ton of speculation about this incident in the many years it's been, one witness account stands out among the rest, and that is the account made by the science teacher from the school, Andrew Greenwood. He was alerted to the UFO event by a hysterical student, and when he went outside to see for himself, everything changed. Previously a skeptic of UFO stories, Andrew's mind was abruptly changed when he saw, as he described it, a round silver object about the size of a car with a metal rod sticking up in the air. He went on to explain that suddenly 5 planes came and surrounded the object, all while more people were gathering to watch. He called what happened next the most amazing flying he had ever seen, explaining that, quote, every time they got too close to the object, it would slowly accelerate, then rapidly accelerate, and then move away from them and stop. They would take off after it again and the same thing would happen. This went on for about 20 minutes before the mysterious object just vanished. As weird as this all was, what was almost weirder was what happened next. Firstly, the headmaster of the school is said to have tried to put a stop to anyone talking about the incident at all, threatening severe punishment to any student or staff who was caught speaking about it. And when the Royal Australian Air Force contacted him, he refused to talk to them about it at all. There have also been stories of witnesses getting visits from people warning them not to speak of the incident. Andrew explained, quote, when he asked the physical education teacher to describe what she had seen herself so that he could compare it with his own observation, she just wouldn't say anything. Another witness who did talk to Andrew and described what she had seen in great detail, just 30 minutes later refused to speak to him and wouldn't say a word. Was this because of the threats from the headmaster, or was something else going on here? This is definitely a strange UFO story that leaves behind a lot of questions. In our number 4 spot today, we have Flight 1628. Back on November 17th, 1986, Japan Airlines cargo flight 1628 was flying from Paris to an airport near Tokyo when they had a very strange UFO encounter. On the part of the flight where they were over Alaska around 1711, the crew witnessed 2 unidentified objects to the left of their craft. The 2 objects rose up quite quickly to meet the craft and continued to fly alongside it. Each object had 2 rectangular things that are said to have appeared to be some sort of glowing nozzles or thrusters, but the crew on the plane couldn't see much else. They weren't able to see if there was anyone or anything inside. The closer these objects came to the plane, the more light was let inside, so much so that at the closest points, the plane's cabin was totally lit up and the captain even said he could feel heat from the lights on his face. After this, the two objects left, but this was not the end, because a third, much larger disc-shaped object showed up and started following the plane. In the end, the plane needed to make an emergency landing in Anchorage, Alaska, because this third craft was seriously large and incredibly frightening, and they just needed to figure out what was going on here. The plane landed successfully and investigations were conducted, but to this day, no one is exactly sure what the men on board saw, but the entire crew witnessed the exact same thing. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Mount Rainier incident. This incident took place when Kenneth Arnold was en route from Chehalis, Washington to Yakima, Washington on June 24, 1947. Kenneth was traveling in a privately owned plane when he suddenly saw a bright flash on his wing. He looked around, and this is when he saw a chain of 9 unidentified flying objects approaching Mount Rainier. He explained that he, quote, could see their outline quite plainly against the snow as they approached the mountain. He continued on saying, quote, they flew very close to the mountain tops, directly south to southeast down the hog's back of the range, flying like geese in a diagonal chain-like line, as if they were linked together. From here, he explained that, quote, they were approximately 20 or 25 miles away, and I couldn't see a tail on them. I watched for about 3 minutes, a chain of saucer-like things at least 5 miles long swerving in and out of high mountain peaks. They were flat like a pie pan and so shiny they reflected the sun like a mirror. He also told investigators that he had never seen anything travel that fast in his life. Unfortunately, Kenneth's story was met with disbelief and a bit of ridicule. This made Kenneth quite resentful, but he said, quote, they can call me Einstein, Flash Gordon, or just a screwball, but I am absolutely certain of what I saw. He added that if he ever again saw phenomena in the sky, even if it were a 10-story building flying through the air, he would not say a word about it. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Broadhaven UFO sighting. This UFO sighting took place back in 1977, and it all started when an entire class of children all claimed to see some sort of object flying through the sky. The children rightfully were confused and excited over what they have seen, but of course the teachers and adults around them believed it was just their wild imaginations making things up. This is when they decided to split all of the children up and have them draw whatever it is that they saw. While there of course were variations in all of the children's drawings, they all basically drew the exact same thing, which begs the question, did they really all see this thing? The children weren't the only ones who saw it either. Shortly after their sighting, other local residents began to explain that they had seen something strange flying through the air, including one hotel owner. One of the things that really gets people about this case and these sightings in particular is that all of these people claim to have seen something at that time, and even though it's been almost half a century, not a single one of them has ever said it was a hoax or that they were lying about what they saw. They all have the same story they did the day it happened. Finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have Betty and Barney Hill. The Betty and Barney Hill case is definitely one of the most famous UFO abduction stories ever told, and it absolutely has some pretty compelling components. Basically, the story goes that the two were driving on a road in New Hampshire one night on the way home from a trip the pair had taken. Before they got in the car on their way home, they were at a diner and figured that if they really pushed through, they could beat the wind and rains from an approaching hurricane. It was 10 p.m. when they left the diner, and they figured by around 2 a.m., 3 a.m. latest, they'd arrive home. As they drove, out of nowhere, a bright light started to follow them. Suddenly, they arrived home, and it's somehow daylight now. Their clothes are dirty and ripped, and their watches had stopped working. This is all jarring enough, but neither Betty nor Barney could figure out what had happened. They were both missing time. Later, during a session with a psychiatrist, they were able to recall being touched by aliens during their abduction. Project Blue Book would come to investigate their claims, and while people remain skeptical, no one has ever been able to debunk their story. This officially went on to become the first ever widely publicized abduction story, and to this day people still debate what really happened to the Hills.
Moon landing plans. We are trying to go to the moon again, but that might not happen for a while. Revised schedules in a leaked document show that the agency is preparing for more inevitable delays, distinguishing between baseline dates and the schedule as it stands, a canned schedule that would prioritize regular launches, and a content program that would only launch when each component of each mission is ready. Under the content schedule, the Artemis 3 mission wouldn't launch until 2026, with a rover making its way to the lunar surface not before 2032, as opposed to the currently projected 2030. But there's one problem with launching the Gateway. The rocket configuration of the agency's Space Launch System, SLS, called Block 1B, is far from ready. In fact, just the tower it's building for the launch of this SLS iteration is already way over budget and behind schedule, just like the entire SLS program. Then there's SpaceX's Starship, also under contract with NASA to send astronauts to the lunar surface, which appears larger and more capable than the Gateway. Now NASA is clearly still trying to establish the schedule of returning the first NASA astronauts to the moon since the early 1970s, and the dates are slipping fast. Number 9. Leaked video. A leaked Navy video captured in July 2019 showed a sphere-shaped unidentified object flying over water near San Diego. The footage obtained by a documentary filmmaker and shared with NBC News appeared to show the mysterious object flying for a few minutes before disappearing into the water. The video was captured by a Navy aircraft and recorded in the USS Amza Combat Information Center, according to the filmmaker Jeremy Corbell. The clip appears to show a spherical object flying above the water for a few minutes near San Diego before it vanishes. "It splashed," military personnel can be heard saying in the video. The Defense Department confirmed the clip was recorded by Navy personnel and said it would be reviewed by the Pentagon's Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, a panel established to gain insight into the nature and origins of such objects. Number 8. Multiple objects in the sky. Ryan Graves, a former Navy pilot who testified that he witnessed unidentified aerial phenomenon UAP with his own eyes, called on President Joe Biden to investigate the mysterious object spotted in American airspace. Ryan, a former fighter pilot, explained that after 2014, when upgrades were made to our radar system, our squadron made a startling discovery. There were unknown objects in our airspace. And these were not just mere balloons like the Chinese spy balloon that dominated the country's attention in February. These were no mere balloons, they could hold their position, appearing motionless, despite Category 4 hurricane force winds of 120 knots. They did not have any visible means of lift or control surfaces, in other words, nothing that resembled normal aircraft with wings, flaps, or engines. These are not isolated incidents, Ryan said. We have a real UFO problem, and it's not balloons. The point is that we don't have a clear understanding of what's above our heads as we thought we did. There are uncertainties up there that we have to deal with, and if we don't do it, our adversaries are going to take advantage of that uncertainty, that weakness, to spy on us with various means, as we've seen. It's pretty clear if there are things over our head that we're not sure what they are, well, we need to figure it out. If they're adversarial, it's a national security issue, we have the mechanisms for that. If it's not a security issue and it's not an adversarial platform, then it's a matter of scientific inquiry. Now, it's crazy that he was even allowed to speak on this, and to be honest, it kinda makes me scared. Number 7. ADAR. The Pentagon's new Office for Investigating Potential UFO Sightings received hundreds of new reports in 2022, and while it can explain more than half of those events, a sizable chunk remains a mystery. Within the new batch of sightings, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence say they're focusing on some 171 cases, including some in which objects appear to have demonstrated unusual flight characteristics or performance capabilities and require further analysis. Since it was formed last summer, the ADAR office has received 366 reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. That total reflects 247 new UAP reports and another 119 that occurred before March 2021, but hadn't been included in an earlier report. The new numbers indicate a step in a rise of UAP sightings. The report released in June 2021 listed just 144 reports, covering a 17-year period. With the subsequent additions, 510 UAP reports were in their files at the end of August 2022. Officials say they believe the rise in UAP reports is due to US government efforts to destigmatize the topic of UAP and instead recognize the potential risk the phenomenon poses, both as an aviation hazard and potential adversarial activity such as foreign surveillance efforts. Number 6. Secret Space Station. Back when the NASA space program was all over the news in the 60s, the USAF was simultaneously working on a more covert program. The Manned Orbiting Laboratory was a top-secret United States Air Force initiative, with the main objective being to serve as a manned satellite to spy against the Soviet Union. The shuttle never officially launched and the program was shut down in 1969. However, thanks to declassified documents, we can see how the government intended to keep a watchful eye over the Soviet Union. Number 5. Trump's tweet. Okay, this is kind of funny, but let me explain. There are thousands of satellites in Earth's orbit right now, and hundreds are operated by the United States military. While the public has known of their presence for years, the actual capabilities of our spy satellites were unknown until former President Donald Trump tweeted a classified image in September 2019. From the image of the exploded rocket launched in Iran, experts were quick to identify the satellite as one of the United States' KH-11 reconnaissance satellites, which for obvious reasons, there is not a lot of known information about it. Now this man literally posted a classified image on his Twitter, and people still think he didn't hide documents in his bathroom. Yeah, okay. Number 4. Space threats. A document leak from a Discord chat room by Jack Texiera, a member of the Massachusetts Air National Guard, spoke about space threats. The leak comes as the US Space Force enters its 3rd year of operation, and as senior Pentagon leaders sound the alarm over increased threats coming from space. Space Force General Chance Saltzman, the chief of space operations, said the Pentagon is assessing an incredibly sophisticated array of threats that include jamming of communications and GPS satellites, spacecrafts that can grapple other satellites, lasers that can dazzle them, cyber attacks, and even nesting dolls or satellites that release others that spread out and track adversaries' spacecraft. The leaked document showed Russia has also experimented with its Tobel electronic warfare system in an attempt to disrupt SpaceX Starlink satellite system. In its annual space threat assessment report, the Center for Strategic and International Studies found that China continues to make progress towards the goal of becoming the world leader in space. Over the past year, China has continued to grow its space and counter-space assets, maintaining its status as the 2nd most capable space nation after the United States. China has also developed a space station in low Earth orbit, landed a spacecraft on the far side of the moon, and a rover on Mars. It also plans to put astronauts on the moon and is targeting the lunar South Pole, where NASA's Artemis program also intends to send astronauts. China by far has the most dynamic space program of the 2 US rivals, US officials say. One of the leaked documents say China's overall military strategy to establish and maintain information dominance in conflict drives Beijing's development of space and counter-space doctrine, capabilities, and TTP or tactics, techniques, and procedures. Number 3. Navy pilots talk about UFO. Recently, 2 former Navy pilots were interviewed by 60 Minutes on CBS News about a UFO sighting over the Pacific Ocean in 2004. Commander Dave Frander and Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich spotted the unidentified object during a training exercise but were unable to classify it. Dave described it as a little white tic-tac looking object, adding that it lacked conventional exhaust plumes and had no wings or visible markings. It also moved erratically, the pilot said. In an interview with NBC News, Dave described the 2004 encounter, calling the object the strangest, most obscure thing I've ever seen flying. As soon as we look down, we see the white water, and then we see this little white tic-tac. It's pointing north-south, and it's just going forward, back, left, right, he said, adding that it was bouncing around like a ping-pong ball. Dave said he approached the mysterious object to take a closer look, and it began mirroring his movements. Then when the pilot got within a half a mile of the UFO, it suddenly vanished. Again, I'm shocked that they were even allowed to speak about this at all. Number 2. Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book was the code name for the systematic study of unidentified flying objects by the United States Air Force from March 1952 to its termination on December 17, 1969. The project, headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, was initially directed by Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. Project Blue Book had 2 goals: to determine if UFOs were a threat to national security and to scientifically analyze UFO-related data. Thousands of UFO reports were collected, analyzed, and filed. As a result of the Condon Report, which concluded the study of UFOs was unlikely to yield major scientific discoveries, and a review of the report by the National Academy of Sciences, Project Blue Book was terminated in 1969. The Air Force supplies the following summary of its investigations. No UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force was ever an indication of a threat to our national security. There was no evidence submitted or discovered by the Air Force that sightings categorized as unidentified represented technological developments or principles decibels beyond the range of modern scientific knowledge, and there was no evidence indicating that the sightings categorized as unidentified were extraterrestrial vehicles. By the time Project Blue Book ended, it had collected 12,618 UFO reports and concluded that most of them were misidentifications of natural phenomena, clouds, stars, etc., or conventional aircraft, which is kinda lame. And coming in at number 1 is Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Among some of the Pentagon's most secretive programs is the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. The program was dedicated to investigate reports of unidentified flying objects, UFOs, but for years it was never formally acknowledged by the Department of Defense. The program was first made public on December 16, 2017. The program began in 2007 with funding of $22 million over 5 years until it ended in 2012. The program began in the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, and according to the Department of Defense, the AATIP ended in 2012 after 5 years. However, reporting suggests that the U.S. government programs to investigate UFOs continued. The agency claims they stopped receiving funds in 2012, however, many believe it continues to operate to this day.
Number 10 spot, we have the Disclosure Project. The Disclosure Project is a non-profit organization founded in 1993 by Dr. Stephen M. Greer, who was a physician and UFOologist, and the goal of the project is to bring forth information about the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence and their interactions with humanity to the public and government officials. The organization has collected over 800 witness testimonies from military, government, and intelligence officials who have had direct involvement with UFO sightings and extraterrestrial encounters. Literally, this entire group is aimed at doing exactly what we're here talking about today. The Disclosure Project believes that governments around the world have been suppressing information about the existence of extraterrestrial life and that the truth needs to be disclosed to the public. We love a little whistleblowing. They advocate for the declassification of government files related to UFO sightings and for public hearings on the issue. The organization has received criticism and skepticism from some who believe their claims are unfounded. However, the Disclosure Project continues to push for transparency and the release of information to help us better understand our place in the universe. Did you see those James Webb photos? How are we supposed to understand our place in the universe? Alright, when the universe is that big, buddy, still processing it. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Chilean UFO. Okay, so it turns out that there's been a lot of UFOs spotted in Chile, and the government isn't exactly shy about releasing some of the footage. In 2010, the Chilean government released a series of UFO footage that has since become one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the history of the phenomenon. The incident began in November 2010 when Chile's National Agency for UFO Research received reports of strange objects in the sky over the country's capital, Santiago. The agency then requested the assistance of the Chilean Air Force to investigate the sightings. The Air Force dispatched a team of experienced pilots to investigate the objects, which had been picked up on radar. The pilots were able to track the objects and capture video footage using advanced equipment. The footage showed multiple objects flying in formation at high speeds, performing maneuvers that seemed impossible, really, for any known aircraft. After careful analysis, the Chilean government concluded that the objects were not weather balloons, they were not aircrafts, or any other known objects. While the government did not explicitly state that the objects were extraterrestrial in nature, the incident has been widely regarded as one of the most credible pieces of evidence in support of the existence of UFOs. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Go Faster video. In 2017, after the existence of the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program became more well known, a video was released of an encounter between an FA-18 Super Hornet and some sort of unidentified flying object. This encounter wasn't actually supposed to be released initially, but the New York Times allegedly leaked it, so the government didn't really have much of a choice and decided to release it themselves. This video was the third in a series of 3 videos. We will talk about another one later on in this list. With this particular video, there weren't a ton of details released about exactly exactly what happened during this encounter, but using the Raytheon Advanced Targeting Forward-Looking Infrared Pod, they were able to capture an extremely fast-moving white oval that was around 45 feet long. The oval had no wings and didn't appear to have any kind of exhaust either. They were tracking the UFO at an altitude of 25,000 feet just above the Atlantic Ocean, and they were shocked as the craft rotated on its axis and flew away. There was no explanation released with the footage because it truly is unbelievable and currently unexplainable. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Phoenix Lights. The Phoenix Lights UFO incident occurred on March 13, 1997, when thousands of people in Arizona reported seeing a series of bright lights in the sky in a V-shaped formation. Eyewitnesses described the lights as silent and moving slowly across the sky. The event gained significant media attention and became one of the most well-known UFO sightings in history. Some skeptics dismissed it as flares or a military exercise, but many other witnesses remained convinced that they had witnessed something otherworldly. One of the most interesting witnesses in this case is former Arizona Governor Fife Symington. In 2007, he decided to reveal that he had seen the object himself, and not only this, but he described it as not from this world. Despite the multiple witnesses and this government official's testimony, the incident remains a mystery, and to this day, no official explanation has been given for the strange lights seen in the sky. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Project Blue Book sighting. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Richard French was once tasked with being an investigator for Project Blue Book, which was the name used to describe a study of UFOs conducted by the United States Air Force from March 1952 to December 17, 1969, when the project was terminated. While his job was meant to be to investigate and essentially debunk UFO sightings, later in life he took to Congress to stand up and explain his own UFO encounter that he was never able to explain away. The moment that truly stuck with him all of these years took place back in 1952. He was sent off to Newfoundland after there were reports that a UFO had crashed off of the coast of St. John's. As he arrived to the scene, there were at least 100 people who all stood and stared into the water, and as he was able to follow their gaze and see what they were all looking at, he couldn't believe his eyes. He recalled the water being quite clear, and under it you could see 2 circular crafts, each one approximately 18 feet in diameter. He said that they were both floating just below the surface of the water, no more than 20 feet from the shore, and not only this, but he could also see 2 beings with the crafts. He said, quote, "The first thing I saw was the UFOs, and it was apparent to me that they were doing something to the craft, and I couldn't really tell what because they were on the bottom side of it and not visible to me except when they would occasionally get over to the side where I could see them." He claimed he watched on as the beings worked on the craft until one of them raised out of the water and disappeared, but not before accelerating to speeds in the neighborhood of 2,500 to 3,000 miles an hour. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Coyne Mansfield incident. The Coyne Mansfield helicopter incident occurred on October 18, 1973, when 4 members of the Ohio Army National Guard were flying in a helicopter over Mansfield, Ohio. Suddenly, they encountered a large metallic disc-shaped object that was hovering in the sky. The object began to move towards the helicopter, causing the crew to take evasive maneuvers. Despite their efforts, the object continued to follow them, eventually passing overhead and disappearing into the distance. The crew reported the incident to their superiors, and an investigation was launched by the military and the Federal Aviation Administration. The incident received significant media attention, and it remains one of the most compelling UFO sightings on record. What makes this incident particularly intriguing is the credibility of the witnesses. The crew were experienced pilots with military training, and their account of the incident was corroborated by radar data and other witnesses on the ground. Despite the extensive investigations, no satisfactory explanation has ever been offered for what they saw that day. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Congress report. For this one, we are talking about a recent report that was delivered to Congress from the Director of National Intelligence. Basically, since August of last year, there has been a total of 510 unidentified aerial phenomena observed in protected airspace or near sensitive facilities. According to the report, 26 of these were described as drones, 163 23 were labeled as balloons or balloon-like entities, and 6 were described as clutter, whatever that means. This is all fine and well, but the concern sets in when we consider that this leaves 171 sightings unaccounted for, some of which, quote, appear to have demonstrated unusual flight characteristics or performance capabilities. It's also important to note that the majority of these sightings are coming directly from Navy and Air Force pilots. Here's the thing. What we, as the public, know is only a 12-page declassified summary of the actual, real, secret report that was delivered to Congress. Only time will tell if we ever find out what the rest of the report includes or what will happen with further investigation into the 171 sightings, but hopefully if answers do arise one day, we'll find out. In our number 3 spot today, we have the advanced technology. So this UFO sighting comes from a while ago, but it just recently became quite relevant, and that is because some former US Air Force personnel have begun explaining to the Pentagon that they believe back in the 60s there were UFOs that supposedly had the ability to turn off their nuclear warheads. Apparently these officers recently told this to the government's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, who had contacted former Air Force ICBM launch officer Robert Salas to get information about the encounter with an orange flying disc that switched off 10 warheads at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana in 1963. There was another former officer, Dr. Robert Jacobs, who also apparently told the AARO that he had gone as far as to make a film of the UFO for the Air Force in 1964, and that this film captured images of a UFO shooting a test missile out of the sky. With the piquing interest in UFOs and the potential for an advanced civilization apart from our own, it appears as though the government is spending more time now researching and looking into these claims because, well, why would they make them up and then continue on with the same story some 50 years later? In our number 2 spot today, we have the USS Nimitz Tic Tac UFO incident. This UFO sighting comes from 2004. On November 14th of that year, the USS Princeton noticed an unknown aircraft of some sort that was about 100 miles off of the coast of San Diego. For 2 weeks prior to this crew had been tracking a strange flying object that would start out at around 80,000 feet before extremely quickly dropping to hover right above the Pacific Ocean. Commander David Fravor and Lieutenant Commander Jim Slate went over in 2 fighter jets, and when they arrived they saw what at first appeared to be churning water, while there was an oval shape just below the surface. After this, a white oval-shaped object appeared above the water, but it had no markings on it. Like no windows, nothing that would indicate an engine, no wings, and the infrared monitors on the jets didn't pick up any sort of exhaust. The commander and lieutenant commander tried to intercept this strange aircraft, but it very quickly flew away and reappeared on the monitor 60 miles away. And when I say quickly, I mean that it was moving at 3 times the speed of sound and over twice the speed of the fighter jets. So faster than any kind of technology we currently have. We still don't know exactly what it was, but it certainly was beyond our current capabilities. Finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have the Roswell incident. This incident is like the mecca when it comes to a government leak. I mean, this incident is infamous for a reason. The whole thing started in 1947 when some sort of crash took place near a ranch in Roswell, New Mexico. Shortly after this, the Roswell Army Airfield released a statement saying that they had recovered a flying disc from the ranch, but the Army quickly retracted the statement and said that it wasn't that, but instead it was just a conventional weather balloon. So it was a little sketchy, but most people just let it slide until the 1970s. What happened in the 70s is that a retired lieutenant colonel began to speak out. In an interview with a UFO researcher, he said that the weather balloon story was a cover-up and that alien remains were actually recovered from the crash site. There were both first and second-hand witnesses who claimed that not only were there at least one, but possibly more alien spacecrafts that had crashed at the scene, but also that extraterrestrial remains were recovered by the military, who then began to engage in a cover-up. In 1994, the story changed from a weather balloon to a nuclear test surveillance balloon from Project Mogul, and it was stated that the stories of the alien bodies were probably just test dummies that had been dropped from high altitudes. I'm not gonna lie, the whole thing sounds a little sketchy. I obviously wasn't there, so I can't say for certain what happened, but someone is definitely lying about it. That's what I know.
We have
Operation Midnight Climax. This experiment took place in the 1950s, and it was one of those mind control research projects that was sponsored by the CIA. This was actually just one experiment that was a part of Project MKUltra. So basically they wanted to study the effects of LSD, but instead of finding willing participants, which, let's be honest, probably wouldn't have been that difficult, instead they used non-consenting people who were lured to safe houses by sex workers who were being paid by the CIA, and then once at these safe houses they were slipped the drug and monitored from behind a one-way glass. For over a decade, the project gave the government more knowledge about the drug itself and what it does to the mind, it gave the knowledge about surveillance technology, and even sexual blackmail. In the end, the project was shut down in 1965, but people don't forget, and the damage was already done. In our number 9 spot today, we have Operation Washtub. This operation came to light in 2014 when documents became declassified and more people could learn about this Cold War era operation. Basically, this was a covert mission that had its sights set on Alaska. The plan detailed the training of different people who lived in Alaska. Like, we're talking just ordinary residents. They wanted to train these people to both code and decode, and a few other different spying tactics, which would have been so cool. I mean, I would have wanted to be picked so badly. Not that I would have even known it was happening, but you get what I mean. Basically, the plan was put in place in case the Soviet Union was to invade Alaska. Then these unsuspecting ordinary citizens would use their newly learned espionage techniques to get all the intel they could and secretly relay that information to high-ranking US officials. As we now know, of course, this invasion never occurred, so the contingency plan wasn't needed, but there were 89 lucky temporary agents who were trained just for this purpose, and I have never been more jealous in my entire life. In our number 8 spot today, we have Project Minaret. This is a document that became declassified in 2013 as a part of the National Security Archive's efforts. This historical document describes a sort of watch list of prominent Americans who were critical of the Vietnam War. The document explains that their overseas communications were tapped and listened into by the government from 1967 to 1973, and a quote from the document reads, quote, "President Johnson wanted to know if the domestic anti-war movement was receiving help from abroad." The project expanded so much that it went on to include more than 1,600 people, including civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Whitney Young, and Muhammad Ali. There were also people like Democratic US Senator Frank Church of Idaho, Republican Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, a New York Times columnist, and a Washington Post columnist. The surveillance began under President Johnson, but it continued on through to the Nixon administration. In the end, the only reason it was stopped was because Attorney General Elliot Richardson was concerned about its very doubtful and murky legality and decided that during the Watergate scandal that it probably would just be best to shut it down. I mean, they definitely had enough on their plate already at the time. In our number 7 spot today, we have Project Iceworm. This secret mission took place in the 1960s, and it was basically intended to build a series of mobile nuclear missile launch sites under the Greenland ice sheet, because this would then house medium-range missiles close enough that they would be able to strike targets within the Soviet Union. This project was called Project Iceworm, but there was another project called Camp Century. Basically, Camp Century was to test out Project Iceworm and see how likely it would be and how feasible it would be. So engineers went to work and created a network of underground tunnels and buildings that included places to stay, kitchen, a hall for hanging out, there were supply rooms, and even a communication center and a nuclear power plant. This was all kept as a super secret for a long time and was even kept from the Danish government for 7 years. In 1966, however, the project was cancelled because of the shifting ice. This created unstable conditions for the underground tunnels that are most likely crushed now, but still remain beneath the Arctic. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Pentagon crash. We have all heard about the devastating September 11th, 2001 attacks, but some of you might not know that on the day, there were actually 4 separate coordinated attacks, all a part of the same plan, and one of those attacks was on the Pentagon. There was a photo that was previously classified but eventually has been released by the US government, and it shows the absolute devastation that was done by the commercial plane that crashed into the Pentagon. The plane was able to tear through all 5 rings that existed in the building. All of the people on board the plane that day, as well as 125 people that were in the building at the time, passed away in this horrible event. For obvious reasons, the initial photos of the Pentagon damage were withheld from the public or from circulating in the media, but now that they have been released, it just shows us all another side to that horrible, terrifying day. In our number 5 spot today, we have the UFO report. This photo is of a previously classified document from 1963. Although the document still has a lot of information that has been blacked out, the document is the description and report of an unidentified flying object or UFO encounter. This is said to have taken place over the desert of Nevada, and the report was written in detail in order to have a written record of the event. This document is said to be the authentic report from the FBI, which is exactly why some of the details have still been omitted, despite it being declassified. This might seem like less of a big deal now, as in this day and age we have declassified video footage of similar kinds of encounters, but for 1963 this was huge. As discussions of alien or extraterrestrial life is a big part of our modern society, this document shows that these things have been on our minds for many years now. In our number 4 spot today, we have Project 1794. This project was created with the goal to build a sort of saucer-type aircraft that would be designed to shoot down Soviet bombers. The program, which was created in the 1950s, was quite ambitious and had some pretty lofty goals. A team of engineers began trying to build a disc-shaped aircraft, but here's the real kicker. They wanted it to be capable of traveling at supersonic speeds at high altitudes. The documents about this project show that they wanted it to be able to travel at Mach 4, which is 4 times the speed of sound, and they wanted it to be able to reach an altitude of over 100,000 feet. At the time, the project was estimated to cost about $3 million, which is about $26 million today. In the end, the project was cancelled in 1961 because the craft failed tests and proved to be aerodynamically unstable, which of course would provide a whole slew of problems at high speeds, especially supersonic ones. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. So for this one, this is a mission that was created in response to a Soviet Union secret mission called Almaz. Basically, this program, called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, was run by the Air Force and the intelligence community's National Reconnaissance Office, and the goal of it was to spy on and throw the Soviet Union off track in space. Some of the documents in this mission have now been declassified, and according to them, one of the goals was to knock some of Moscow's satellites out of orbit or to fire projectiles at them. They even wanted to try and capture one of the Soviet satellites in space and then basically send it back down to Earth so that they could study it. That's so wild. And because of this, Moscow equipped their secret space station with a rapid-fire cannon in order to stop any of this from happening. I seriously feel like I'm watching some sort of space action movie right now. I can't believe that these are real things that happened and they were created in the 60s and 70s. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Lunik kidnapping. Don't worry, Lunik is not a person and instead is a Soviet lunar satellite that was kidnapped just for one night. This project honestly sounds like it was taken straight from a movie, and it has to do with the Great Space Race. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union wanted to make it as clear as possible that they were winning the race to space, so they launched a multinational exhibition of their Lunik satellites, which became the first spacecraft to impact the moon's surface, and when the Luna 3 returned, it brought with it the first ever pictures of the moon's far side. It was a big deal, and it's safe to say that the US wanted to know everything that they could about it. Of course, the satellite was heavily guarded, but it was traveling from city to city for this exhibition, so undercover CIA agents went to work. Basically, they convinced the man who drove the transport truck to get some rest at a nearby hotel, and basically they would look after it for him while he rested. I'm sure it was a bit more complicated than this, but you get the gist. From here, the agents then took apart and photographed every single component of the thing before putting it back together and placing it back in the truck for its next tour date. There is no indication that before the operation became declassified that anyone outside of those involved knew what had happened that day, and I'm not gonna lie, that's a pretty hilarious plan, and the fact that it worked is both shocking and pretty impressive. In our number 1 spot today, we have Operation Paperclip. This operation began in 1946 when the President of the United States at the time, Harry Truman, authorized it. Basically, the entire point of it was to lure scientists from Nazi Germany over to the United States after the Second World War. This was done in an effort to aid the country in their post-war efforts, as well as to ensure that the valuable knowledge these people had would not end up in the hands of perhaps the Soviet Union or either side of the divided East and West Germany. Army. Had it not been classified information at the time, this would have of course been highly controversial, as many of these people were involved in, and sometimes even leaders of that hateful party. Former President Truman stood by his decision, saying that because of the relations with the Soviet Union, quote, this had to be done and was done. Several of the scientists a part of this program were later investigated because of their former ties, but one was only ever tried out of the over 1,600. None of the paperclip scientists were ever found guilty for any crimes either in the United States or in Germany. Perhaps the most famous of all of the paperclip scientists was Wernher von Braun, who played a huge role in advancing NASA's Apollo missions.
Want to see more videos like this one? Check out this video right here. It's about illegal Bibles from around the world that the Pope himself doesn't want you to know about. Click the video now to find out more. See you in the next video.